Given the crisis unfolding in the Church, I thought it might be wise to explore the untold history of the problem. To be sure, and this is not popular to say in Catholic circles at the moment, the problem is caused by homosexual priests in the Church. There are no solid statistics on the number of gay members of the clergy due to canon law prohibiting gay men from serving in the priesthood. But this problem is actually a symptom of a larger problem. The Catholic Church was infiltrated more than a century ago by its enemies, and with the sole purpose of destroying the Church and remaking her in their demonic image. I intend to explore this history of the problem and how it led to the present sex abuse scandal. In a future video, I'll likely go over the arguments against permitting sexual deviants of all kinds from serving in the clergy. First, some backstory. The Church has historically had two great enemies. Neither Protestantism nor Islam are actually either of the great enemies, though they themselves are the product of at least one of them. The first great enemy is Freemasonry, though some dispute the threat posed by the Freemasons today, and I'll explain the logic of that denial and why I think that might actually be false to assume that the Freemasons are harmless today in part 2. The second great enemy is communism, and I'll be addressing them in this video. The communist infiltration of the Catholic Church began in the 1930s by order of Joseph Stalin. One former Communist Party member, Manning Johnson, testified before the Congress's House Un-American Activities Committee in 1953. The following is a quote from that testimony. Once the tactic of infiltration of religious organizations was set by the Kremlin, the communists discovered that the destruction of religion could proceed much faster through the infiltration of the Church by communists operating within the Church itself. The communist leadership in the United States realized that the infiltration tactic in this country would have to adapt itself to American conditions and the religious makeup peculiar to this country. In the earliest stages, it was determined that with only small forces available to them, it would be necessary to concentrate communist agents in the seminaries. The practical conclusion drawn by the Red leaders was that these institutions would make it possible for a small communist minority to influence the ideology of future clergymen in the paths conducive to communist purposes. The policy of infiltrating seminaries was successful beyond even our communist expectations. French communist Albert Vassett revealed in 1955 that Moscow had issued a 1936 order that carefully selected members of communist youth to enter seminaries and, after training, receive ordination as priests. There was a special focus on religious orders, particularly the Dominicans. According to Dietrich von Hildebrand, the French Dominicans had become so communistic in their evangelization that in 1953 the order barely escaped being dissolved by the order of Pope Pius XII. Perhaps the most famous of these communist figures was Bella Dodd, a former Catholic who, like many young people today, fell away from her Catholic faith when she was young and filled the void left by religion in her life with political activism. She fell into communist politics and became a fervent communist, joined the party, and worked to undermine Western civilization by attacking its heart, the Catholic Church. She eventually became a member of the Central Party in the United States. In the following audio, Bella Dodd lays out the overall communist conspiracy. Listen carefully because the audio is 60 years old.
Now the communist conspiracy really should not have the word communist before it. It should be called the conspiracy for world control. The communist conspiracy, like all conspiracies, is a secret organization of a group of people who are determined to gain control or who are determined to accomplish something illegal, sometimes in a legal way and sometimes in an illegal way. Now what is it that the communist world conspiracy, or the world conspiracy, seeks to accomplish? Now the conspiracy consists of a small group of people. They are not necessarily located in Moscow or in Leningrad or in Stalingrad or anywhere else in the Soviet Empire. The communist conspiracy consists of men and women who are located in New York, in Moscow, in Paris, in London, in Saigon, in Hong Kong, and throughout the world. Yes, in Leopoldville. The communist conspiracy consists of a group of people who are no longer concerned about what happens in Utica or in Rome or in Kalamazoo or any other small area of the United States or France or England. They are a group of people who are determined to control the natural resources of the world. Yes, they're interested in controlling oil and controlling iron, steel, uranium, yes, timber and land itself. Now this conspiracy for world control of the natural resources of the world leads to many strange phenomena which confuses the people of America who think in terms of those who are interested in business should be against communism. Well, they should be in reality, but unfortunately their sights are set upon immediate control. And for that reason, you will find that a man like Frederick Vanderbilt Field, people ask me over and over again, why should a man like Freddie Field, whom I knew very well in the party, why should he be interested in the communist movement? He is comfortable, he is in business, they have great holdings. Well, the answer is that the world communist conspiracy consists of several different types of groups. And unless we understand that, we cannot achieve an understanding of the problem of how to defend ourselves. So the conspiracy, then, is a small group. Now, the conspiracy operates under many different kinds of labels, because in order to gain control over the natural resource of the world, they must control the 2.5 billion human beings there are in the world. And there must be different ways of controlling them. Now, the way they control the Soviet Union or Russia was by actually taking it over physically by revolution and establishing a static control over the peoples of Russia. Thus, in 1917, a very small group of members of the Communist Party, aided and assisted by the world conspiracy, financed by the world conspiracy, were able to establish hegemony and control over 200 million people of Russia who didn't know what had hit them. Now, the communist conspiracy, the world conspiracy on a worldwide basis, operates under different labels at different times. Sometimes it uses the communist label, sometimes it uses the socialist label, sometimes it uses the humanist label, sometimes it uses goodwill label. It is willing to use any group of people that they can move into action for the ultimate control.
If that sounds like we're delving into the realm of conspiracy theory, please note that it was indeed a conspiracy, but it was a fact. The Communist Party had infiltrated organizations across the world, and especially in the United States, under a variety of guises, all with the purpose of undermining those organizations and twisting them to their purposes. Remember the time period we're talking about. Dodd was providing her testimony in the early 1950s. Starting in the 1960s, society in the West began its deconstruction, using sex and racial politics as the driving wedge to undermine social cohesion under the guise of egalitarianism and fraternity. Nowhere was this seen more starkly than in the Catholic Church. In the 1960s, Catholics wrestled with the issue of artificial contraception, with most Catholics and clergy being in support of its use. Pope Paul VI issued Humanae Vitae and reinforced the Church's historic prohibition on contraception, but was roundly ignored by the faithful. It is doubtful that this would have been the case to the extent that it was if Humanae Vitae had been issued in the 1940s or the 1950s. Unfortunately, radical changes brought by the Second Vatican Council and the sexual revolution instituted a rebellious tendency in the laity and in the clergy, leaving Paul VI and traditional Catholics isolated. Bella Dodd, in her testimony, recounts the effects of communist influences in places she traveled. Perversion and sexual deviancy was rampant. Sexual liberation, if you want to call it that, was unleashed on Europe and especially pre-Nazi Germany by the communists in order to make the population more easily susceptible to their influence. Dr. E. Michael Jones recounts this in several of his books, labeling sexual liberation as the principal tool of political control, and I'll be letting him speak on that himself momentarily. The Communist Party sold itself quietly to Americans of all stripes through deceptive use of American and Christian values.
During those years when I was a communist, unfortunately, I was the kind of person who was moved and impelled into the communist movement because I believed that they were interested in improving conditions of the working class. Having been a Christian, I had the residue of the Christian desire to improve conditions, to help my fellow man. But I had lost the key as to how you do it, because there's a right way of doing it and a wrong way of doing it. And what the communists are doing all over the world today is they are appealing to Christian consciences, to the conscience of those who are believing in spiritual life. They're appealing to those consciences, and then they're pointing out the evils which exist and saying, look, it's because of Christianity, it's because of the spiritual life that these things exist. What you need is a scientific approach towards this, and we'll give it to you. In other words, they besmirch those things which make us strong. And so in 1932, when I became a communist, I could see only the evils which existed. I saw the lines of people who were poor. I saw the lines of people who were on the red lines because of the Depression. I lived through the Depression. I was a young woman through the Depression. My heart was big. But my head, unfortunately, was not well trained. And I failed to understand the evils which I was associating myself with. And so from 1932 to about 1938, I used to work as a teacher. I used to come up here to Albany. I used to come up to Albany to lobby for the teachers' union. And then I'd go back and work with the trade unions, the labor unions, the people on strike and so on. I always say that as a communist, I worked 26 hours a day. And that's one of the things that Americans need to learn, too. Those who wish to save this country have got to give more of their time and their attention to it. By at first, I joined the movement out of a will to goodness. And by the way, that's one thing you have to understand. If you don't understand that there are millions of human beings throughout this world who are joining the communist movement out of a will to goodness, you will make very sad mistakes. Misguided will to goodness. They don't know where they're going, they don't know what they're being trapped into, but a will to goodness nevertheless. However, those who remain in the Communist Party, like myself, who joined originally for will to goodness, actually stayed because it gave us a sense of power. As time went on, I got more and more power. In 1938, I left my job as a teacher, and I took a job with the trade union movement. I took a job with the teachers' union. I organized teachers' unions throughout the state, just as I had to organize unemployed councils throughout the state. And then I decided that the Communist Party needed me more, and they had asked me to join openly. In 1943, I joined the Communist Party openly and became a member of its National Committee. But during all those years, I was functioning with the party and was a member of the party. I was making contributions, I was getting instructions, I was admitted to their secret meetings, and so on. So that there was lie upon lie in the living within the communist movement. But as I said before, the will to goodness may start you off. But if you stay with the movement, largely it's because of the desire to get power.
You can see what Bella Dodd was talking about in that clip today. In the United States, the political activists who proclaim the false gospel of social justice are driven by an honest desire to help people. Their perceptions are misguided, but the typical young activist is driven by this sense of injustices needing to be fought. It's when you see these seasoned veteran activists that you encounter those individuals who have power and are driven by it. Yvette Falarca comes to mind, she of the San Francisco domestic terror, Antifa, and BAM fame. But I digress. You see the same thing in the church today. Is there any doubt that Jesuits like James Martin honestly believe they are fighting against injustices in the church? Certainly they believe that, and that is what makes them so dangerous. It is when you see figures like Worrell and McCarrick that you see that corrupted motivation on stark display. Dodd claims that she personally recruited over 1,100 communist men for infiltrating into American Catholic seminaries. 1,100 men, prior to the 1950s. The timing is critical. Quoting from her congressional testimony, and a link is in the description to an archive of the transcript, in the 1930s we put 1,100 men into the priesthood in order to destroy the church from within. 1,100 men to destroy the church from within. Think about the implications of that. The aim was not to convert the church to communism, but to destroy the church, which would be fundamentally the same thing. If you wonder why priests and bishops today rarely sound like their counterparts from earlier eras, that is the reason. If you wonder why so many priests today seem obsessed with politics, that is the reason. And if you wonder how so many men living the San Francisco lifestyle infiltrated the ranks of the church, and how men like Worrell and McCarrick attained such high levels in the Vatican, and how men like James Martin became celebrity priests, remember those 1,100 men that Bella Dodd recruited. Worrell, McCarrick, Martin, and their peers are the ideological children and grandchildren of those men. We are now suffering under the consequences of her actions today. What does communism have to do with the crisis of homosexuality in the church? If it was merely a problem of Marxists in the ranks, it would be easy to ferret those people out, right? Perhaps, but ideology misses the point. The aim was not to turn the church into a Marxist organization. The aim was to destroy the church. And the best way to destroy the church was to undermine its claims regarding sexual morality and its most basic claims to moral authority by infecting its ranks with sexual deviance during the sexual revolution. Sexual revolution is a method of political control. E. Michael Jones explains.
The key to understanding the sexualization of our culture is that sexual liberation is a form of control. Most people don't understand that. They perceive it as a kind of freedom to act on your desires. But there's a long history of people who understand how they can use this to control people. Our nature is to be rational. It's to be reasonable creatures, to recognize the order of the universe as created by God. That order, the Greeks gave a name for that order. They called it logos. Logos is translated as speech. It's rationality. It's the order of the universe. It's the mind of God. It's all of these things all wrapped up in one. And that's the nature of what we are. But we've been created with passions or appetites. And these are necessary to survive. But in order to keep them in proportion or where they belong, they have to be subjected to reason. Now, everybody understands this when it comes to something like the appetite for food. Everybody knows that if you eat too much, you're going to get fat. And if you get fat, you're not going to be healthy. Or if you drink too much, you're going to get drunk. And if you get behind the wheel, you're going to kill yourself or hurt somebody. But it's harder to understand with sex for some reason or other. Because it's such an insistent desire. And there are people who understood that if you promote this, you cloud people's understanding. The scholastic philosophers like St. Thomas Aquinas would say, lust darkens the mind. That's his way of understanding it. It can eclipse reason. And these people who were understanding this, and I'm talking about beginning with someone like the Marquis de Sade, during the French Revolution, all the way up to Wilhelm Reich, the Freudian communist, wrote during the 1930s. They realized if you increase these passions, you can manipulate people and get them to do what you want to do. So it became a form of control. And so at the same time, Reich was studying Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was using these insights to control people. In a sense, rich Americans, so he could get money from them. His nephew was Eddie Bernays, and he's the father of public relations and advertising. And people began to realize you could use this to control people. And that's, in a sense, the history of what we're talking about. The history of the sexualization of our culture is really the people who control the culture, let's call them the oligarchs, have discovered that this is a very effective way to bring people under control. And so they control the media, they control what we see, what we think, and they control it for their interest, not for our interest.
The church was infested with men and women suffering from same-sex attraction in order to bring the church to heel. If you've ever confessed a sexual sin in the confessional and have been given a lukewarm, half-hearted absolution, then you know what I'm talking about. Acceptance of sexual immorality has been a growing issue in the church since at least the 1950s, if not earlier, when Catholic prelates began undermining church teaching on contraception and then freely ignored Pope Paul VI's condemnation of contraception under the guise of a personal conscience. Today we see this flaunting of the church's moral teaching by men like James Martin and all the guilty bishops and cardinals associated with the cover-up of the sex abuse crisis. As evidence, I present the condition of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, or Bishop Robert Barron, or other public figures in the hierarchy who have been taken by worldliness. A strange defense of Catholicism you see by many Catholics as saying, quote, the church is great because of all the social services the church provides. Or the bishops engaging in political banter that defends the interests of the oligarchs at the price of human decency. And I'm speaking explicitly about their love of environmental issues and immigration. The church has been brought to heel through sexual immorality infesting the hierarchy of the church. It doesn't matter to many Catholics that the San Francisco lifestyle has been explicitly condemned by the New Testament, by Saints Peter and Paul, as sins that cry to heaven for vengeance, or that the church has always called that lifestyle intrinsically disordered. Now, sexual immorality has been permitted to reign, leading to an acceptance by prelates of the sex abuse crisis, as evidenced by the cover-up. Yet, they covered it up, but only because they know that the lay faithful would not accept the sins of the bishops and priests. This did not happen in a vacuum. The infiltration of the church by communists and homo-heretics wouldn't have been possible if the ground was already fertile for the acceptance of heresy. How did that happen? The answer lies with the incredible pontificates of Pope Leo XIII and Pope St. Pius X, who warned the church about the infiltration of the church by Freemasons and modernists. They took steps to delay the infiltration of the church by her enemies and made the clergy and members of religious orders swear an oath against modernism, an oath that was required until the closing of the Second Vatican Council. But that's a topic I will cover in part 2. Thanks for listening. In this time of crisis, it is important for all faithful Catholics to adhere to the traditions of the Church, and in accordance with Canon 212 of the Code of Canon Law, to speak out against heretical members of the hierarchy. Subscribe to this channel and join me in this fight to preserve the faith. Ave Maria.